Today marks the second installment in our new sermon series called Hope in Hard Times. I want to say a word about the structure for this sermon series. Those of you who are from a background where in the life of your home church, you were kind of a high church, a high liturgy congregation, you may be accustomed to reciting a phrase called an acclamation of faith that goes something like this: Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. Our structure for this sermon series is a sort of adaptation of that structure. Last Sunday, we added the statement, Christ has lived. Today, Christ has died. Next week, Christ has risen. And the week after that, Christ will come again. And it's our hope that throughout this series, you'll have an understanding that regardless of the season of life in which you find yourself, there is something within the life cycle of the life and faith of Jesus of Nazareth and in the eternal ministry of Jesus the Christ that speaks to whatever broken place, whatever struggle place there may be for you. Now, about hard times. Some of us may not have experienced them yet. But rest assured, each and every one of us, all of us at some point in life, goes through a season of hard time. And they can come in any of a variety of ways. Hard times can come through loss. Hard times can come through grief. Hard times can come through an absence of enough. Hard times can come through an abundance of sorrow. Hard times can come through transition. Sometimes transition, even if it's planned, like Coach Marlene was talking about a moment ago. We all know there's going to be the end of eligibility. There's going to be the end of some season, and transition will follow. But sometimes transition is unplanned. And many of us know the sting, the deep-seated hurt of seeing a relationship, for example, transition. Something powerful, something that we cared for is lost, and hard times follow. Sometimes hard times come out of regret for past decisions, mistakes, even things that we thought were going well that eventually it turns out we can see the other side and we realize now hurts have been caused and it's a hard time. Some of us come here this morning having followed the evening news or gone to some aggregate news site day after day online and learning about decisions and statements that are being made, and we come here very torn, very disillusioned from what we hear coming out of places like Pyongyang or Washington or Charlottesville. Stan spoke of it in his prayer, his deacon prayer this morning, chaos and division. Chaos doesn't even necessarily require multiple people to be involved. Sometimes chaos can be just what swarms in my own heart. And so each and every one of us at some point in life is going to go through a hard time. Today's sermon title is called Christ Has Died. And our passage of Scripture is found in Mark's Gospel. It's the Good Friday passage from Mark chapter 15. If you've brought your copy of the Bible today, or if you have it on your device, I encourage you to read along with me as we look at Mark chapter 15, beginning at verse 21. Mark, which we believe to be the original gospel, the earliest telling of the life and ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus, tells the story of Jesus' death this way. Mark chapter 15, starting at verse 21. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's Son." You may be surprised this morning that we're not going to proceed on to the story as it continues 3 days later. We're not going to continue on to the story of resurrection. You and I already know the rest of the story. We know that 3 days later, the stone was rolled away, that Jesus strode triumphantly out of the empty tomb, victorious over death itself, and that promise of death subsumed, cast aside, is something that is promised to us. Jesus does this once and for all. He uniquely goes to the cross and goes through the empty tomb, but in it we all share the victory. We won't look ahead at that passage today, and the reason is because some of us in this room are experiencing or have or soon will experience a hard time, a season of grief in life in which the outcome will not seem clear. There will be a time of struggle. There will be a time of sorrow. And I want you to remember this, that even in the worst time, even in the deepest sorrow, even in the hardest struggle, even in the hardest time, God is still at work. The hardest place is still a place of transformation. The lowest place sometimes can be the place where God is most at work. And in studying this passage today, I hope we will leave with an understanding that when you go through just such a season in your life, God is present, God is active, God is bringing transformation, and God is bringing you out. We don't always have full perspective, but hopefully we will know and will be prepared to know the lowest place is still a place of transformation. 4 things in particular that I want us to notice from this passage that speak to transformation in the hardest time. The first one is found in verse 39. Of those 4 examples of transformation, they'll follow this structure: one that is visible, one that is invisible, one that is tangible, and intangible. Visible, invisible, tangible, and intangible. Look with me at verse 39 and see the story of the centurion. Now, in the ancient Roman army, a centurion was a person of great renown and respect. Much like a captain in our army today, someone who commands troops, but someone who is not yet at a high enough level that, as my brother-in-law says in the Navy, he's not yet driving a desk. He's close enough to his men. He's close enough to those who are serving with. That this is the type of officer who will often go out with those people who are serving, or will often go ahead of them to make sure they know that this officer has their best interests at heart. A centurion was often the highest ranking officer that people in Palestine would ever see. This was the face of the Roman Empire. Because among the peasants, among the riffraff, particularly among the farmers who lived outside of Jerusalem, out in the countryside, when would they have ever seen the local governor? When would they have ever seen the emperor? When would they have ever seen a provincial governor? They would not. They might have heard a trumpet, they might have seen a chariot, but they would have had no interaction, very little, with anyone higher than a centurion. So here stands this centurion, the face of the Roman Empire, present for the very crucifixion of Jesus, rumored to be the King of the Jews. And at the moment that he sees Jesus breathe his last, having witnessed such bravery, having witnessed the integrity by which Jesus went to the cross and by which he received the ridicule that was hurled upon him there, in the face of such suffering, the centurion had this to say: truly this man was God's Son. There was something about the very presence of Jesus. Not only his words. Last week we talked about his teaching and preaching ministry. It wasn't just what he said as he went around to the villages. It wasn't just what he did in terms of working miracles in people's lives. It was simply in his appearance, his presence, the way he filled the space there on the hill called Golgotha that made it clear to the face of the Roman Empire, here is God's Son. Now, as a Roman official, this centurion also would have known all of the legends, all of the stories that were being circulated about the emperor. And to be honest, sometimes the stories were distributed by the emperor. You can imagine how that went. Hey, go tell the people this about me. And so there were rumors, there were legends that said, for example, when the Emperor Tiberius was about to die, he supposedly dreamed a dream that a statue of the Roman god Apollos had told him he would not live to see the statue dedicated. At Olympia, the rumor was that the statue of Olympus had laughed out loud the day before the Emperor Caligula died. The statue of Jupiter was reportedly struck by lightning right before the Emperor Domitian died, and so on and so forth. There was a steady stream of rumor, of stories that said when God, the Roman Empire, the Roman Emperor, is about to die, wonderful, amazing things happen. And yet here hangs Jesus, naked, beaten, pierced, bloodied, alone, ridiculed, who dies with such an absence of pomp and circumstance, who dies so alone, so rejected, so humiliated, and yet with such depth of integrity that the face of the Roman Empire in that area says of him, here is God's Son. Sometimes in the hard time, transformation will come your way, and it will be visible. It will be clear. It will be in the presence of someone who steps forward into your life and says, I've been there, let me offer you counsel. Sometimes it will be in the presence of something that someone does for you or gives to you or says to you or pronounces over your life. Sometimes transformation is quite visible in the hard times. But secondly, sometimes transformation comes in invisible ways. Notice who is absent from this scene. Notice who is missing. The very same people who we would most expect to be there. The disciples who have lived and traveled and eaten with Jesus for months, some of them even years now. They've been all over Palestine with him. They've witnessed it all. And yet at his time of crucifixion, they're nowhere to be found. They have fled the scene. They have abandoned him. And yet, even in this hard time, they too are being transformed in some invisible ways. If we were to look over into the very next chapter, if we were to look at the beginning of the Easter story in Mark chapter 16, We would see that in verse 1, the women who had traveled with Jesus for years come back out to the grave. They come there to care for his body, which they believe to be deceased. Just a few verses later, they encounter the word, the message, the reality that Jesus has walked out of the tomb. And they run and they share that message with Simon Peter in verse 8. Word begins to spread to the disciples. They begin to learn that what they had hoped against hope would be true has in fact occurred. And by verse 14, other disciples are starting to learn as well, others who had followed Jesus from afar. And think of the transformation that we know happens in their lives. They may not be present for the crucifixion of Jesus, but transformation is happening nonetheless. Think of the stories that we know from the book of Acts, of the places they went and the people to whom they shared the good news of Jesus, and the way they shone his light and shared his love and proclaimed his name, the way they let the world know of the good news. It's the very reason that you and I are even gathered in this place today. And you thought it was just because Coach told you to be here. It's because these men's lives, these ladies' lives were transformed even though they were not present to see the crucifixion. Their lives were transformed by the invisible work of a love relationship with Jesus Christ in their lives. There's a third way transformation comes in the hard times. And it's a way that is tangible. Look with me at verse 38 at what happens back in the city. Remember, Golgotha, the place of the skull, the hill upon which Jesus is crucified, is outside of town. It's beyond the city gate. But back in town, inside the gate of Jerusalem, is the grand temple complex, the Temple Mount, seated at the crown of the hill above the city of David. And upon that hill stands the temple. The temple of Herod has been under construction for about 50 years at this point. It was arguably the grandest renovation and expansion project in the ancient world in the first century. And now work is wrapping up, and people are coming from all over the world to come and see the splendor of the Jewish temple in Palestine. And the way Mark relays the story, at the moment that Jesus draws his last breath, something wondrous, something mysterious, something tangible nonetheless happens there in the temple. The construction of the temple was essentially two large rectangular rooms next to each other, and they were connected by a large gate. And down the middle of that gate hung a curtain. It was to divide an area that was private for only the priests from an area that was reserved for other more public functions. And inside that area that was more private, there was an even smaller room and another division, another set of curtains that divided the area of the priests for what was known as the Holy of Holies. Mark is letting us know that when Jesus drew his last, the barrier that was set up there was changed forever. That barrier was intended so that no one, even peeking around the first curtain, would be able to see into the Holy of Holies, where legend held it, the very presence of the living and loving God could be found. And the idea was you would go behind one curtain, let it close behind you, and then open the next curtain to go in if you were the priest on call. And only one at a time could be in that innermost setting. Mark is letting us know that when Jesus breathed his last, something powerful took place. That great curtain that had been a divider for all of humanity is broken right down the middle. It is ripped from head to toe, from top to bottom, from ceiling to floor, exposing what lies behind. It is a tangible example that something transformative is happening. And something that is happening not just for Jesus, not just for Jesus' family or his disciples, not even solely for Jewish folk, but for all. The temple is torn. Because you see, lastly, there is an intangible transformation that comes during the hardest times. This is not just an issue for the custodial staff of the first century temple to get in and rehang a new curtain. This is not just a matter for the architects to deal with for how to have a sturdier construction for that part of the facade. This is a theological statement that Jesus is making by breathing his last. For when the temple is ripped from top to bottom, it is a way of saying the intangible truth that now all may come to God. Because of the life and death of Jesus, all may come into the presence of the holy. Another way to say that is if previously they had thought that the presence of the Holy One was confined to some narrow space geographically, now the very presence of the living and loving, creating and sustaining God goes out to fulfill all of creation and beyond. Another way to say that is to say that rather than thinking of God as being confined to some box to whom we go to pay a visit, now our God comes to us, to be with us in whatever season of life we may find ourselves, whether the high place of celebration or the low place of sorrow, our God comes to be with us. When the temple veil is torn, it is this intangible statement that no matter what is happening in our lives, no matter where the source of the hard time may have come, our God is with us and is bringing transformation. Now, there's an application of all of this meaning, and it comes right from our newspaper, right here in Georgetown and in Scott County, and perhaps you know some of the story that I'm about to share with you. A story of hope in the hardest times that reminds us that the lowest point is still a place of transformation. How many of y'all know the name Jared Lorenzen? Some of you know now the story that I'm about to share with you. I won't get into all of the nicknames that the former University of Kentucky quarterback has carried throughout his career. They're actually part of the source of sorrow in his life. Jared Lorenzen, at a different time, when we were young, was rewriting the record books at Fort Thomas Highlands, University of Kentucky, won a Super Bowl with the New York Giants, his backup quarterback, played his ball at about 285 pounds. That's a lot of quarterback to try to bring down. But then as he went on into professional ball, his weight was redistributed, and later on when he left the NFL and began to play some Arena League ball, his weight began to change again, and as he got toward the end of his career, he was trying to play ball at somewhere around 450 pounds. When he retired, due to a terrible on-the-field injury in an Arena League ball game, he was at a place in his life where there frankly wasn't a lot that he could do about his physical condition. It was his lowest place, but it was also a place of transformation. And that transformation would come in very, very tangible, very, very visible ways, particularly through his introduction to a Georgetown College athlete, a Georgetown College alumnus named Anthony Holt. Anthony was one of the very best athletes on the legendary 1998 basketball national championship team. Anthony now lives in California, where he produces projects, and along with his many business partners, he works sometimes with his cousin, Derek Anderson, from Louisville. Jared and Anthony they were aware of each other for a long time, but they were introduced to one another at an event in Lexington, where Anthony approached Jared and made what sounded like a business pitch, suggested to him that they collaborate somehow on something connected to Jared's life. To which Jared responded, "Whatever, dude." He was not interested at all. How could he tell the difference between Anthony coming and making a bona fide offer about something that they could do to invest in Jared's life, or any of the other people who wanted a piece of Jared Lorenzen? And so, they went their separate ways. There was so much that Jared didn't know about the intangibles that were happening in Anthony's life. He didn't know, for example, that Anthony was already getting connected with a foundation called the Now Let's Get Fit Foundation. For 3 years, he had been keeping up with the work that this group was doing, particularly in Alabama. They had already had, for example, an outdoor event where they tried to get all the young people from this community out into a community park to do things like kickball and inflatables and spinning classes and Zumba out on the tennis courts. Anything to get people active so that they would remain healthy. Jared didn't know that group that Anthony was connected with had already done one event with another celebrity, with Karina Smirnoff of Dancing with the Stars. Not that I watch Dancing with the Stars, or maybe I do, and I can say that openly, and it's okay. Y'all don't judge. But he did this event with Karina that was an indoor event trying to get people out as well. Jared didn't know that Anthony already had a personal training relationship with a celebrity trainer named Gunnar and a celebrity nutritionist named Philip out in California. Jared had no idea of any of these intangibles in Anthony's life. And he certainly didn't know that when Anthony Holt, Georgetown College alumnus, approached him, he had two motivations in mind, neither of which had anything to do with making a buck. His first motivation was to help this Kentucky folk hero for whom Anthony had immense respect. And secondly, to provide a platform to allow this captivating personality to inspire others to be healthy. Well, the Lord works. And the Lord works in our lowest places just as assuredly as the Lord works at our times of celebration. And so a couple of years later, Jared and Anthony met again, this time at the University of Kentucky Hall of Fame dinner. And Anthony again approached Jared and again made a pitch, and some way, somehow, made it in a way that began to convey a genuine concern for Jared as a human being, as a child of God, and also as someone who could be a catalyst in the lives of others to help them be healthy. And this time, Jared was in a frame of mind to listen. They followed up out in California, went on out to where Anthony has his place of business, and by now, Jared was up over more than 500 pounds. You probably know the rest of the story. Just within the last month, there's been an announcement that Anthony and Jared are going to partner together with Jared's production company on an 8-part video documentary telling the story of how Jared is determined to get healthy. But also, there's been the construction of a mobile gym that's going to go around connected with Jared's story, giving folks like you and me an opportunity to learn practices that will lead to our own physical health. And anybody and everybody everywhere is invited to follow along via social media and other traditional platforms. Jared sees hope. At that lowest place in his life, God was bringing about transformative work that was visible and invisible, tangible and intangible, and the rest of us now have the opportunity to see it in the relationship between Anthony and Jared. In closing today, I want to ask you to think just a moment. I don't want this to be something that interrupts your day. I don't want it to be something that's so painful for you that you're not able to proceed with it throughout the course of your day. I know many of you have important commitments. But I want you to consider for just a moment whatever your season of hard time may be, whatever the cause of your grief, whatever the cause of your sorrow, whatever the diagnosis in the lives of your loved ones, whatever the transition that has taken place, whatever the brokenness may be. And remind yourself, despite all of those things, God is at work in your hardest times. Where are those visible places where God's love is beginning to shine forth in your life? Where are the invisible places that you're not where you need to be yet, but you're further along than where you were a week or a month or a year ago along this journey? Perhaps you're someone who hit that season of hardship in your life 4, 5, 6 years ago, and you're able to look around and see what a difference the Lord has made in demonstrating God's faithfulness unto your life. For some, your response to God's goodness needs to be to give testimony to it, just as Marlene has done this morning. For some, it needs to be reaching out to a teammate or a classmate or to a family member or to a loved one back home or to a new loved one here in this place and say to them, I see the hurt and sorrow and difficulty in your life, and I recognize it because I have been there too, but let me tell you of the faithfulness of our God. That just as our God was at work in the lowest place in the life of Jesus, so too will our God be with you in the days to come. And I know that there are still others for whom this is all news. It is all new today. And so this morning, as we move into a time of response, I want to encourage you that if you've never made a first-time commitment, if you've never looked around and said, before, where is God? But now you look around and you see the faithfulness of God in your life. If you've never said yes to a love relationship with Jesus Christ, the Son of God, we want to invite you to do that now. Our musicians are going to come and lead us into a time of response. Some will pray, some will want to serve, some will give, some will sing, but others need to give their lives back to Jesus. And if that's your decision today, then as they sing, as they lead us in response, won't you come forward and share what's on your heart? Won't you come forward and enter into a life of discipleship, walking in the way of Jesus? Or if you need to connect some way, somehow, with other leaders in the faith, in the life of this church or others in our community, we'd love to begin that conversation now. Would you stand with me? And as we sing and as we pray, however it is that you need to respond to the work of the Holy One in your life, we stand now and we sing in hopes that you'll come.